the first few decades of the internet, and even at the sort of the original advent of the web, there was no commercial use of it whatsoever.
It was against the rules. You had to sign an agreement to get an internet account saying you would use it for research only. I remember at the beginning wondering if the work I was doing even counted, because we knew if we opened it up to advertising, it would turn into a strip mall, which it did. The operating system really does dictate how the social or interactions are going to take place. And we, on our internet in the West, the language, the underlying operating system is capitalism.
Hi, Rabble.
Hey, Alice.
So this week's guest is Doug Rushkoff. Started life as a journalist, has published 25 books, has been putting a podcast out every week since 2015 called
Team Human.
Team Human. And so you had a really fascinating conversation with him about the intersection of people and technology and what goes wrong and where things need to go right, and also the owners of those technology platforms. So I think you have a great kind of story to tell about Doug's interaction with some of these billionaires.
Yeah, so Doug was an internet person going back to the early 1990s and late 1980s. And so he saw people go from technologists and participants in the community, folks like Ev Williams, and become billionaires. And he became known as people thought of him as a futurist. They thought of him as super insightful on how the internet and people and markets and everything works. And so he often gets brought in to speak to executives, speak to billionaires, speak to others about the future, about where things are going, to give them context. And he got flown to this, I don't know where, maybe it was Wisconsin or something, or Wyoming, this sort of Grand Tetons Ranch type thing. And they go out and he's talking to them about the future and what goes on and everything else. And then eventually they get to their real question, which is, where do you go to escape it? Do you build your bunker in Montana or New Zealand or some other, southern Patagonia in Chile? Like, how do you escape the societal collapse? And he was dumbfounded because he was like, you guys are the powerful people who could do something about it. And yet instead of doing something about making society better, they were trying to figure out how to escape from the collapse that they were creating.
Yes.
And went down crazy paths. Like, how do you keep your security guards loyal to you once money doesn't matter? And could you put shock collars on them or something insane? And Rushkoff was like, no, you have to be part of Team Human. You have to realize that it is social bonds, it is human bonds, it is mutual aid, it is society itself that holds us together, and it is not money. And his podcast, Team Human, is all about that. And this episode was so resonant in the world that we have today that now there are TV shows and movies, all of which are based on the plot of this one sit down he had.
I mean, it's really calling to mind Gilead and The Handmaid's Tale. I am picturing it right now.
Yeah, and the crazy thing about what Margaret Atwood did with that, there's nothing in The Handmaid's Tale that has not happened.
I know.
That's the craziest part. Every single thing she describes in The Handmaid's Tale has happened in human history. None of it is like, it's a alternate history science fiction thing, but all of the elements have happened. They are all things that we as humanity have done to each other.
And are doing more of now. I mean, it's not all history either, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, all right, well, let's take a listen.
Today on Revolution.social, I have one of my heroes, author, media theorist, critic, Doug Rushkoff. Doug has been putting together this campaign, this idea, this movement around Team Human, and that we need to center what we're doing with the internet around humanity, around human connection, not around just the computers for computer's sake or corporations controlling what we're doing, but really centering what we're doing, which is about human connection. And in the era of AI, with AI slop and all these other things, it becomes even more important. So welcome, Doug.
Hey, thanks for what you're doing.
You have this idea of sort of the Renaissance versus the simulation, this sort of juxtaposition of, do we take old ideas and put them into new contexts, or are we doing sort of a simulacra of it? And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, a little bit about just what we should be doing with the internet when we think about as it evolves.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I started using the word Renaissance in like 1992, back when people were sort of describing what was coming as a revolution. And I felt like revolutions were so kind of 20th century, and they just put someone else on top of the same system, where a renaissance, literally to renaissance, you're rebirthing old forms in a new context. And it seemed to me, and this is in my great early kind of psychedelic, netizen way of thinking about things, I looked at all the innovations of that era, and they seemed to be kind of analogs or corollaries of things that happened in the original Renaissance. So they got the printing press, we got the internet. They got perspective painting, we got the holograph. They got circumnavigation of the globe, we got the orbiting of the globe. They got calculus, we got, chaos math and new physics. There were all of these ways that it felt like, oh, wow, there's a kind of a dimensional leap that's about to happen, to this much more holographic, hyper-textual sensibility. And it seemed to correspond to, James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, arguing that all life is part of one big conscious being, and that this technology would shepherd that. So I liked talking about it as a renaissance. But what I also realized back then, and people were saying, oh, you were such a tech optimist. And I think I was a hopeful tech realist. Whoever could choose what gets rebirthed in a new context would define the way this is. So either, we, like the pro-social people, will get a new peer-to-peer society and women's rights and earth consciousness, that'll be rebirthed in this new context of digital technology, or the capitalists will come back, and the colonialists and the controllers and the whatever we want to call them, the toxic masculinists, are going to rebirth what they're doing. I feel like we as early as 93, 94, we kind of lost that battle. It used to be a kind of a California counterculture that was defining what the internet and social were going to be about. And then Wired came and said, no, this is a money-making opportunity. This is a way, so this is something to invest in. And once you invest in technology, right, you're not looking at empowering people, you're looking at controlling them.
People forget that the first few decades of the internet, and even at the sort of the original advent of the web, there was no commercial use of it whatsoever.
It was against the rules. You had to sign an agreement to get an internet account saying you would use it for research only. I remember at the beginning wondering if the work I was doing even counted as research, because I was just exploring, and people were like, no, it's cool. It's fine. Partly because it was government funded, and partly because we knew if we opened it up to advertising, it would turn into a strip mall, which it did. 2016,
right after Trump won the election, there was a platform co-op conference, and you gave the keynote at that conference. And to me, that was a really powerful sort of call for what social media should be, what the internet should be, and calling to account folks like Ev Williams. I don't remember if you mentioned Jack specifically, but the big social media companies that had given rise to Trump being able to win the election, and a call back to understand the roots of Web 2.0, the roots of social media, and that there is this alternate path. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit, if you remember back to that argument, and that thread we see through all of your Team Human work.
Yeah, well, it was interesting. I did 2 keynotes for that conference in successive years, right? So the first year was this bigger kind of throwing rocks at the Google bus talk, which might have been, I don't know if that, so was this one in this big auditorium? Because I did one in a smaller, yeah. So the one in the big auditorium.
Huge auditorium.
Yeah, it was before Trump had actually won. It was the year before, so he was starting to win. What I was really looking at it's kind of encapsulated in the title of that book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. Not to say we should be throwing rocks at it, which is the way business people understand that title, but more as a poetic kind of look at what it's come to. That Google was two Stanford kids in their dorm room coming up with a kind of an algorithmic way of indexing the data on the internet. And it was these two kids who were going to take down big bad Yahoo. You know, it's like a company like Yahoo is deciding how the web is organized, and this is going to be the people's bottom up self-organized thing. We don't need their damn platform. We're it. And how the growth of that company after they pivoted to become a data mining company, the growth of that company, their inability to accept profits of just $5 or $10 billion a year by needing to get to the $100 billion a year or $500 million, whatever it is, how they had to really turn even their technology into a means of control. And the way that that company then ended up, along with Facebook and a few others, really making San Francisco unlivable for the people who were there, and turning, if anything, to use your simulation word, turning, San Francisco into a sort of a Disneyfied version of San Francisco for tech workers to feel like they're doing something cool. Then they would hop on this bus and go down to Mountain View where Google was, and they were draining prosperity from the communities where they operate. So what I was really looking at was how were these technology companies, which originally promised kind of distributed prosperity for us all, how did they become really the enemies to mutual prosperity? And how was the growth mandate, kind of exponentialized with digital technology? How is that working against every human being who's trying to create or retain value with these things?
Yeah, it's like we had this internet that allowed peer-to-peer human connection, allowed a different way of doing things, reduced the cost of communication. And so we imported all of the, it's a renaissance. We imported all of the human activities in there. And there was this assumption that somehow it would just be magically better. And we then created institutions that became able to extract unbelievable amounts of value out of the system.
It was innocent, though. I mean, you could talk about Jack. I mean, I didn't really know him so well, but I knew Evan from Twitter. And I remember, because we had been friends since, before Blogger. And I remember the day I saw his picture, it was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, the day that Twitter had its IPO. And they had, under the faces of each of the founders, they had the amount of money they made that morning. And under Jack's face, it was like $4.3 billion. And first I thought, oh my gosh, this person I know and admire, he's a good guy. He's from like Iowa. He's like a farmer kid who's always meant well. He's made $4.3 billion. That's cool. And then the next thought was, oh, this guy's fucked, right? Because he's just accepted $4.3 billion or his share of a company that allows people to send 140 character text messages to each other. This is a company that was already making $2 billion a year. It's like, how much more than $2 billion a year can you make on a 140 character messaging app? Really, that's probably about the max, and it should be. But now he's got these investors who are going to expect him to 100x that 4.3 billion that they just gave him. And that was just a piece of it. And there's no way he's going to do that without, killing the platform or turning it into something truly awful.
That is sort of what we started to see. We started to see this consolidation where Twitter had went from this really open, creative, chaotic thing to now there was a massive pressure from VCs and eventually the public markets to chase the same thing, how do you reconfigure the social media platforms for maximum expression of profit.
And just as a side note, notice everyone how Rabble used the phrase, it was this wonderful chaotic thing, right?
Yeah.
It was a wonderful chaotic thing. It was not a mean, treacherous, troll baiting, horrible thing. When left to its own devices, right? Which was just let people do what they're going to do. The bias was towards collaboration, cooperation, and certain social norms that emerged naturally from people engaging in an unfettered way on a fairly neutral platform. It didn't turn fucked up and evil until the platform became about monetizing things, until sensationalism and until it developed algorithms that really did prioritize sensation and captivation and engagement over just what people would want to do normally.
And people forget that. They forget that there was an earlier era of Twitter when it wasn't known as this super toxic place. Instead, it was this place where you met new people and you dropped spontaneously into these sort of networks of conversations and you felt part of the zeitgeist.
That didn't require centralized government censorship or control, right? It was not a, not that we shouldn't have regulation. I love regulation for all sorts of things, but it was not a byproduct of regulation on the platform. It was a byproduct of actually a form of openness that hadn't yet been dominated by a certain form of capitalism.
That corporate structure that we had there, that this sort of, it owned the thing, and the investment behind it, it pushed it to a certain kind of structure, and it set up that evaluation of extracting the capital. And I don't know if you know this, but like Jack has said that the original sin of Twitter was the corporate structure, was that it was not like the rest of the internet. It wasn't a protocol, and there was centrally corporations there, and that's what eventually led to the pressures that caused it to be this thing that optimized for engagement, optimized for rage, optimized for the kind of things that created Gamergate, created sort of troll wars.
But Jack has said a lot of different things at different times.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So yes and no. So he'll be like, don't let Musk take over Twitter, or do let Musk take over Twitter. Oh, now it's Blue Sky. It's going to be the thing. And then oh no, it's not Blue Sky. I'm going back to Twitter. So, I mean, like any of us, he's, driven by the same capriciousness. Sometimes these things look great. Sometimes they look awful. It is true. If Twitter had been a decentralized protocol, like
blogging and podcasting.
Yeah, although podcasting is moving increasingly towards YouTube and Spotify.
Blogging, we've got some platform consolidation going on there.
Yeah, we do. Blogging happens where? Substack is sort of Mark Andreessen and his investors at Substack are creating something that at first is looking like a great way. Oh, look, if I'm on Substack and all the other Substackers but they're creating their moats around that. It's those of us who are in there are seeing the rising tide of enshittification, making a decision to be there less reversible than one might like. So we'll see. But working with protocols has required just a bit more consciousness of what the platforms are and how they work, and a willingness to do what seemingly looks more difficult at the very beginning. And that's from the command line interfaces, right through to AOL, to Google Gmail and everything else today. I mean, if we had our druthers, we should all be on decentralized nodes on Linux, right?
But it's very hard to run those. It's very hard to set it up, and people have other things going on in their lives. And then, corporations come along and say, well, I'll give you something that feels like that open, noisy human playground where
don't have a
everything
website.
is safe.
Don't build a friggin' website. Get a page on MySpace or Facebook. Isn't that easier?
Don't make a website and a mailing list for your local business and get people to sign up and communicate directly with them. Just make an Instagram page and hope that the Instagram algorithms will show your content to the people in your community.
Right. I mean, for people who aren't like nitty people, it just think of it as like Uber. It's like once they get in sort of an effective amount of market share, it's way harder for an equally easy to use platform cooperative of cab drivers in a city to mount a defense against the thing.
I bet you a lot of people on this podcast don't know what platform co-ops are, or what that idea was, and what the sort of, it was a movement to try and unseat these digital monopolies. I wonder if you could just give us a little intro into what it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Nathan Schneider out of Colorado and Trevor Schultz and I think each independently came up with the idea with different names and we're publishing about it. And then they're like, so we're all seeing this, right? And it kind of comes partly from the Pope of all things, in one of the encyclicals after Marx and, the capitalists and the communists or Marxists were fighting it out. The Pope came up with an encyclical that was sort of balancing the priorities of capitalism, communism. And what he said was, basically the workers should own the means of production. Business works fine as long as the people in the company own the company. So rather than being an employee who could be exploited by your boss, you are a co-owner of the thing. So we were looking at how do you translate that basic kind of notion of cooperative enterprise into the digital age? Because these companies that are exploiting us, you take the Amazons, or the Twitters at this point, they're owned by a very few people and everybody else kind of works for them. Or an Uber. What would Uber look like if it was owned by the taxi cab drivers? What would Amazon look like if it was owned by all those people in the trucks, all those people? What would that look like? And you could say, well, it would look a little different. So you wouldn't have a quasi-trillionaire at the top, but you'd have a lot of wealthy people throughout the org chart of this thing, and you might have a company with different priorities because these people would be thinking about, well, this tech company or this resource company is kind of polluting in the neighborhood where I live. So do we want to be less aggressive this way or that way? So you end up with something very different. So that's really what we were arguing for was, could we use digital technologies? And some people even were talking about blockchains and DAOs and the ways of organizing them. Can we, use digital technologies to create shared ownership of our digital companies?
I went to those platform co-ops and I tried to start one myself, and there was a lot of promise to it. And to me, it was the digital version of like the agricultural co-op. A bunch of dairy farmers get together, and rather than like being exploited by the middleman who is the aggregator of dairy milk and just the production, they pool their resources and they run their own brands and milking factories and all the other infrastructure that is shared amongst them.
Right. Or they create a leveraged buying group. It's like what Ace Hardware does, or True Value. It's a cooperative of hardware stores that can buy stuff as cheap as Home Depot can because they buy it as a collective.
And not each individual local hardware store having to go negotiate with all these other companies. It gives them collective power.
Right, which is another principle from the same, papal encyclical. It's called subsidiarity, which is no company should grow larger than it needs to in order to do its business. If you need to expand to the next town, let someone else start a True Value hardware store in that town rather than you having to own both of them. You should be able to earn a living earning a living, right? You shouldn't have to grow in order to survive.
And instead, we've got these giant digital platform companies that make a huge amount of money in one area. So, Google with its AdSense, for example, or, Apple now with the iPhone and the App Store, or Amazon with originally its online shopping and eventually AWS. And then they just roll them over into all these other spaces. They can just watch new things emerge, new ideas emerge, and apply more resources and capital to copy and dominate it.
And it's interesting, and it's partly because they have to grow. And until now, I would say, the main excuse that companies had to grow and enshittify themselves as they grow was because of their balance sheets, that we understand that we're using an operating system of interest-bearing currency. So our economy has to grow in order to be okay. It didn't have to be programmed that way. It was programmed this way by 11th century monarchs who were looking for a way to make money without doing anything. So they invented a system where they lent any money into existence for any other business to happen, and you have to pay them interest for that service. So that was the reason why businesses have to grow. That's why even today, even nice presidents like Biden says, oh, GDP is going up. The reason GDP has to go up is so bankers can be paid for allowing us to transact using their monopoly restricted currency. But as people are waking up to that, which I think they are, we have a new excuse to grow, which is we have to get to AGI, to autonomous, whatever, artificial general intelligence. That without that, the world's going to collapse. Without that, we're not going to solve climate change. Without that, we're not going to get off the planet to the next place. So all of this stuff, you and your company have to figure out a good reason to use AI, because we all have to use AI so that these companies can grow and we can get to AGI and at least get a few billionaires off the planet.
And there's this assumption that somehow that the world of AGI, or artificial superintelligence, is going to be a world in which a single person, whoever the person is, the Sam Altman or the Elon Musk or whoever it is, they're going to get there first. And because they're going to get there first, the AI will sort of teach itself, and sort of there'll be this accelerating thing. And so whoever wins this race becomes, king forever. They'll
right.
have the technology to dominate all society and all technology for generations to come.
Exactly, which is why then you got to look. It's like, okay, so if Peter Thiel gets there first and his public talks are honest, if Peter Thiel gets there first, then we end up in a monarchy where anybody who's calling for charity or distributed assets is treated as a satanic force. It's like, wow. So because we know his belief is that a select few are going to develop the ability to rise from the chrysalis of matter into pure spirit or consciousness, that some group of people are going to level up to the next thing. And any of us who are trying to distribute resources or feed the poor, we are necessarily robbing resources from the few who were going to make it to the next level. So we're like pulling them down. We're a satanic force, pulling the sacred few down back into the mud and not letting them rise. So if that guy gets his AI and convinces it with his program, it's a pretty dark future we're looking at.
If they get this tool and it really is controllable in the way that they hope it's controllable, and it's really centralized, it doesn't become this thing that is powerful but not held by a few, then it will become very, very hard to unseat this set of power. It's the equivalent in the past of monarchs or others developing some sort of new military technology that no one else can resist. It's the equivalent of Europeans developing gunpowder and tall ships and a bunch of other technology that let them colonize the world.
Right. I know, and I've often thought about that. Whatever civilization dedicates more of its resources to the military or to the warriors seems to be able to beat up everybody else, and I've liked to believe that, a society that dedicates itself to resilience and mutual aid and care ends up strong in some other way. But, it's tricky. I mean, I look at like mycelial networks and think, well, how do they survive everything, underground and non-local and spreading? They go into a spore state. They have all these ways, but I guess they can be aggressive too, right? They can kill you, right?
I think they can be aggressive. And I also think that it's important to realize that sometimes these horizontal networks and these mutual aid networks, they survive by not necessarily putting themselves up as a visible thing. More than, a huge percentage of the internet runs on WordPress, but we don't talk about WordPress the way we talk about Meta or Twitter or TikTok, because it's this distributed network of all these people using a common set of things that interact, but not a central source of consolidated power.
Well, the thing is this, and I always distinguish back from McLuhan in my work too, the difference between the figure and the ground. You know, we see the figure, we see the object, the name, the thing on TV. You know, we very rarely see the ground, which is where human activity actually happens. And that's partly because of our linguistic system. We have a subject-object oriented language system. We teach kids nouns. What's this? What's that? What's this? What's that? So everything is about the thing. You know, when you show a Westerner a picture of a pasture, they see the cow. They remember it as a picture of a cow. You know, and you show people in the East generally a picture of a pasture, they see the landscape and might not even remember what the animal was, you know, in the picture. And that's our problem. But yeah, these more pyramidal dominator names are the ones we remember. I mean, who knows about Apache servers or any of these things? It's like the crew in a Broadway show. You know, they're doing just as much work as the actors, I promise.
I don't know if you read it, but the late David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, they go into this description of this civilization that existed for about 3,000 years in Ukraine. And I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but the Kuteli-Tifilia civilization, the burnt civilization. And this is a civilization that wasn't looked at by archaeologists because they didn't build big temples. There were no palaces, there were no temples, because roughly in these cities, everybody lived in roughly the same kind of size houses. And that periodically they would burn down their towns and build new ones. And they weren't burned down as in they were attacked by the outside, because you could tell because they took all of the things with them. And the narratives we say, the narratives we think about when we think about history and we think about what was done, we don't look at those civilizations. We don't look at the examples of when we didn't have a single or small group of ultra powerful people that had overwhelming dominance of the economy and they could do things in their own honor. There's that thing. And then there's this whole other history which gets ignored because it doesn't produce spectacular things that align with the narrative. You know, we celebrate the Silicon Valley founders. We celebrate their net worth. We celebrate the startups, not in the good that they produce, not in the impact in people's lives, but in how much money they raised and what their valuation is and what the IPO is. It's this, you know.
Right. And as we do that, we create a fame obsessed culture among our kids. You know, which of these figureheads am I going to become? You know, and then we have apps that are about that. I mean, that's the thing. The apps we use are about accumulating the amount of names that get you on the top.
Yeah, we optimize for the star, and and with social media algorithms, we do this thing where we have a platform that has its own desire. Like the companies behind the platforms, they're about, you know, addictive behavior and engagement, and basically the bottom line, they want you to click on as many ads as possible. They want you to engage in that way. And so then they create algorithms that build up the stars that are most effective at not meeting people's needs or telling stories or connecting, but driving people towards their profit.
Yeah. But we're at this place now where I don't even know that most people want social from social media. They don't now. They don't want social from social media. They want fame from social media. The reason why, you know, and I looked at it, in principle, Mastodon would have worked as the alternative to Twitter. Better than even Blue Sky, because it just, you know, by happenstance, Blue Sky was about the liberal exodus from Twitter. A Mastodon, in principle, was the sort of most, you know, the Fediverse and its little things. What was great about Mastodon was you were going to basically choose a sub-community inside the mega network. That's your community. That's really where you're a social network, and they're overlapping. You're not limited, but you are in there. That's not the function. The people didn't like it because, well, I do want to be able to tweet back to Charlie Kirk when he says something I don't like. I want to be in the big thing. And the problem with social media platforms as we know them is they're all global. So everybody is broadcasting globally to everyone all the time. There's no scale. There's no fractal. There's no subgroup. You're just there in the ocean. And it's like, I don't want to throw my writing in the ocean. I'm fine with a sea or a tide pool or what's a community? It's not the ocean. It's a thing. So people don't want that. But, I never really, and never's not true. On the Well and in some Usenet groups, which is like this original internet forum from the late 80s and early 90s. Yeah, it was even
everything
before
else
the internet.
descends from the web. Well,
yeah, it was a way of using your computer to talk to other people with computers and leave messages for them and stuff and have little bulletin board conversations. They were small, and even in those, what characterized those worlds is groups and subgroups and subgroups. You'd log on to the Well, you would pick a conference on the Well, and in that conference, there would be separate topics. So you could go on the Well and say, I'm going to go on the Grateful Dead conference, and now I'm going to go in the conversation about Sugar Magnolia. It was much more like Reddit in that way. There's these big groups and then smaller groups in it. And in a place like Reddit, if you're regular, you do get to know the other people in the area that you're talking about, that you're doing, but it's not infinite. And I'm not even going to call it the problem, but because it's too much, but the people's desire is somehow to have Taylor Swift scale in these things, that each tweet, each thing you send out could potentially become the next multi-million viewed Instagram.
You're, 5 milliseconds of fame.
Right. If you're an individual, or if you're like you or me, we're using it honestly. And this is the thing. I only use the commercial platforms professionally. Or I could argue, since I'm an activist, for my professional activism. So I, make a Team Human episode, and now I have a guy who will find the pithiest or most actionable thing from that episode, turn it into a 1-minute thing and put it on Instagram and put the little words on the bottom and try to get people to look at it. And I could argue at least I'm doing it not for profit, but to try to save the planet from itself or whatever. But it's the same game.
I do the same thing with this podcast where we go and we take things and we get many orders of magnitude more views on those shorts, those clips, than the larger conversation.
I'm still not there yet, interestingly enough. I get, maybe, 25,000 downloads of the podcast, but, only, 5 or 10,000 views of like the YouTube things.
You're not good at playing the algorithm game. Yeah, which may or may not even be a good idea. A few years ago, I moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And when I was there, I started talking to a bunch of Maori technologists and activists and artists. And one of them was describing what Te Reo, which is the Maori language, what Te Reo Twitter was like. And his description of Te Reo Twitter blew my mind, because you have to learn this whole new language in order to participate in that conversation. So that by using language, they had created this same sort of boundaries and barriers that you talked about the Well, of having subforums and stuff. And what he said was that they don't have the same kinds of problems on Te Reo Maori Twitter than they do in English language Twitter, because they have this barrier, and then they can rely on Maori cultural norms that come along with the language around social interaction. It doesn't mean there aren't fights and flame wars and all sorts of arguments and everything else, but it's rooted in, like, the language lets them rooted in a culture that has a different system of conflict resolution, which we don't have on big social.
The operating system really does dictate how the social or interactions are going to take place. And we, on our internet in the West, the language, the underlying operating system is capitalism. It's what
Yep.
it is. It's the art of the deal as
It's the air we breathe.
yeah, but it's a particular way of understanding the world. You know, that Margaret Thatcher said, there is no society. There are deals. There is profit. You know, that's the way it works. And I'm not saying capitalism is bad for certain things. It's go for it. Go for it. It's not what I'd want characterizing the relationship of kids in a kindergarten class. You know, it's not, what am I going to get? What am I getting from Johnny? And, you know, what am I getting from Mary? And it's not that. How do I rise one level of order of magnitude above them so I can be their rentier class to the kids who are in the sandbox? How do I make them pay me a tax to be in there?
How do I, lock in that disproportionate advantage so that every next generation of kids that come along are advantaged or disadvantaged based on the sort of pre-existing power, the accumulation of capital?
Right.
A little while ago, I announced a new app, and I did not think that this app would be a big deal. I was being nostalgic for an earlier area of social media, nostalgic for an era where things were simpler and it wasn't driven by AI and algorithms. And so I, just on my own, hacked together a revival of Vine, and I called it Divine. And you can go and you shoot 6-second videos and you can loop them and you can follow people. And I added a little stuff of human curation, so you can put individual videos on lists, or you can make lists of people and you can follow the lists and you can tag things, and really kind of a callback to the web 2.0 of the era.
Right.
And then I was frustrated with AI slop, and I was like, well, can I figure out a way to prevent that? And I actually ended up using some AI to detect AI, because you have to have your bots fight their bots. And like, my dream was to reach an audience that listen to your podcast. People who are like, they want to know about it. And it's a substantial audience. Like, I was like, this would be great. Like, if I could reach the Team Human audience, everybody who already knows they're on Team Human, this will be a massive success. And within a few hours of launching it on test flight, so it's like the beta, we had 10,000 people sign up for it. And all the servers collapsed, and it went massively viral on Instagram and TikTok. And like, all these people who I have no idea who they are, started posting stuff and going viral and talking about it. And like, the original Vine stars started reaching out to me and asking when they can do it. And it struck a nerve. And to me, it really, like, the most inspiring thing was, it was trying to build what you were talking about in Team Human. It was like, can we build something that is a protocol? It's a protocol, it's open source, you can leave one to the other, and it's got blue sky style composable moderation, and doesn't quite work yet, but the ability to either choose who you follow or create lists so other people can follow them, and eventually algorithms. But the amazing part was how much it seemed like people want this. People want an alternative to AI slop and algorithms and feeling disempowered. From your perspective, as someone who has been advocating for this a long time, what does it mean when it goes way beyond our sort of circle of people who are thinking about this? And what do we do with it? Like, how do we not repeat the mistakes that happened the last time?
If you don't really monetize it, then you won't be incentivized to fuck it up so badly.
Yep.
That's sort of the easiest. I think even if you simply make your choices in good faith to the community, you end up going down a whole different trajectory, right? So I guess you're asking, how do we solve problems of scale when we're not really looking to scale?
I mean, we want it to be for everybody.
I know, but Wikipedia is for everybody. I think it's by having as many human community members in positions of social norm establishment. Reddit did it because they had moderators.
I don't know how closely you're following what's happened with Medium in the last few years, but Tony over at Medium has been really trying to focus on their idea of, different publications on Medium with human editors and human moderators who choose what.
We had that on. That's when what Medium had in the golden era, and then they abandoned that one. And I think they tried to become more like a slightly more collective Substack, where you were getting money based not on subscriptions to your own thing, but on your percent of views, and you'd get a piece of the whole pot. I'm not sure how they're doing it now, but it was weird. But Medium started to feel a bit like a backwater, and I kind of moved on from it for my own stuff. I would be interested to see. I mean, I had a lot of I don't know what they were called, subscribers on there that I felt bad about sort of leaving behind, but I don't know. The whole sometimes when a platform is in search of a business model, they can end up kind of casting you to the side a bit. So
and I think that Medium did that a lot. Medium kept pivoting of not sure where it was going.
Yeah, I mean, and I get it. That's what you got to do, And they never did it in an evil way, so that was always good. But I mean, I went from being like a paid writer for media magazines to just being a blogger. And I was like, I got to see what to do now.
They thought they could build this model that was sustainable on the level that Substack, or now the open source Ghost, provides people. And it turns out that was just being funded with venture capital, and they didn't figure out the sustainable model that people could live on. Right.
I wonder if Substack has that or not, or is that still... I don't know I don't look at their numbers, but it's also, I mean, I have a different relationship to this stuff because, I mean, I started as a professional writer. I actually write for a living. I wrote books and articles for publishers and magazines, and I avoided Blogger and the net for a long time because I felt like I get paid to write. I'm not going to crowd the public space. This is the space for people who don't have publishers, who don't have magazines to write. But then all the professional writers ended up in that space. So now we're using the same tools for people to do journalism as for people to do guesswork. And that's kind of a problem too. I still like it's very old fashioned. I like the idea of professional journalists. There's professional liars in government, and we need professional journalists who are being paid to dissemble those lies. Otherwise, only one side is funded.
And we live in a world today where there are way more journalists working in public relations and PR than as journalists.
Which is a whole other thing.
Thank you so much for all of your work, all of your books, the Team Human podcast, and the talks, and being that critical voice, the media theorist that understands where we got to and how the history of the internet works. I am eternally grateful that you were able to come on this podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. I'm only as critical of technology as I am hopeful for people. So it could still work out.
Absolutely. Thanks again to Doug Rushkoff for coming on revolution.social. Our intro and outro music is a remix of the Italian anti-fascist song Bella Ciao, courtesy of White Records.
This episode was edited and produced by Eric Johnson from lightningpod.fm. Our executive producer is me, Alice Chan from Flock.
To learn more about the Social Media Bill of Rights that describes what we're doing in building a better social media ecosystem, sign up for our email newsletter and visit revolution.social.
And for more interviews like this one, follow revolution.social on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, nostasfountain.fm, or wherever you get your podcasts.
And to paraphrase the Zapatista subcomandante Marcos, we need a social media revolution to make revolution possible. We'll be back next week. See you then.